Good morning. Welcome back to the Deep 404. There is a lot of news to talk about today in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. Alexei Navalny has died. I'll cover this off briefly and then we'll talk some about Avdiivka and some other happenings. Alexei Navalny is an interesting character in the West. He's often referred to as the opposition leader in Russia, as the direct opposition counterpart to President Putin. This is misleading. His party that he was involved in isn't registered. And in the 2018 elections in Russia, the party that received the second most votes was the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. So if you were to refer to the real opposition leader in Russia, you'd probably be talking about someone like Gennady Zyuganov instead of Navalny. The West obviously loves Navalny because he is opposed to Putin and very vocally so. But however, he has died reportedly in a Siberian prison. The IK3 or Polar Wolf, one of Russia's most northernmost prisons. He has a interesting career, and certainly in the West, as I say, he is well supported and looked upon because of his opposition to Putin. If you look today, after his death, President Joe Biden, the US president, has come out and has stated that Putin is responsible for this, and then looked and pointed at the camera. It's Putin's fault. Very much using this as something against Putin, to, as you would expect. If you go and dig a little deeper and read more about Navalny, you will find that he is not someone who you might consider to be the ideal Western democratic person for the West to follow. And I'll leave it at that, but perhaps go and have a look, dig a little deeper into Navalny just to get some background on him. What is interesting, after Joe Biden has come out and has blamed Putin for this and said that it is all his fault that this Russian politician has died in prison, that there has still been no response from the US State Department over Gonzalo Lira's death. Now, Gonzalo Lira was a US citizen who died due to torture and neglect in a Ukrainian prison. So on one hand, you have the President of the United States coming out and saying that this is Putin's fault and terrible, and look at such a bad example that a Russian politician has died. Yet when a US citizen that criticizes the Ukrainian administration dies in Ukraine, there is nothing from the US State Department. If you go and Google around and try and find responses relating to Gonzalo Lira from the US State Department, there's a couple of statements from last year before he was imprisoned, and that's it. So that's a telling feature. You can really see where the US allegiance lies, and even with a US citizen, they will forget about them if it just goes against the narrative. Avdiivka, of course, is the other big thing, and we might just go to our map and have a quick look here. This is a map of Avdiivka. The purple area, this map came from 2 hours ago. The purple area is now Russian-controlled territory. Just to give you a sense of how quickly things are moving here, this is Avdiivka from about 2 hours ago. This is a map from about 10 hours ago. Can I just make that a little bigger? So that map is from approximately 10 hours ago, and this one's from 2 hours ago. So you can see how this purple area has rapidly been relinquished by the Ukrainian forces in that area, and the Russians have moved ahead. The progress of the Russian advance in Avdiivka has been amazing in the last 12 to 24 hours. Last night I was following this, and it was almost every half hour there would be an update indicating a further advance, another street being taken, advances down a road, that type of thing. Footage came out last night showing the showing retreat of Ukrainian servicemen on some vehicle, difficult to tell what it was, an APC perhaps, and the footage was quite sort of poignant and telling. You see them driving out, going past the sign for Avdiivka on the road in. So they were clearly exiting the area, and as they were coming under heavy shell fire around them. The video, you see shells exploding near them. So yeah, it's I commented on X. It's amazing that we just get to see this much of war and what happens from the comfort of our couch. It's really something quite amazing if you sit back and think about it, that this was happening. Quite possibly this was near real time, that this video had been uploaded and to Telegram and then onto X, and you're able to view it and see what these men were going through. Now, I'll just read a little bit here about an update from this morning of Avdiivka. This is from Boris Rosen, who goes by the nom de plume of Colonel Cassard on Telegram. Here, point one. The Ukrainians confirm the loss of Zenit, Syrsykyi, and Vinogradniki. Also, the Ukrainian indirectly recognises the loss of the DFS and its transition to the grey zone. The Ukrainians also recognise the loss of positions south of the coke plant in the city and the advance of the Russian armed forces to Lashtochkino. In the city itself, the Russian armed forces took over the fire department and completely controlled the motor depot and most of Industrialny Avenue. Industrialny Avenue, if we just go back here, is this road running down here, all down the western edge of Avdiivka, and the main supply road came in here, which is now being cut. So that's the area there that he's suggesting. At night, attack aircraft reached the outskirts of Khimik. The current front line in the city will become clear in the coming hours. Cartographers are still late to see what is happening. So here he's suggesting that even many of the updates that we're getting here are behind what is actually happening. The road through Lashtochkino is under fire from Russian troops. You can take another road to the south to Khimik, but is also constantly under fire. The situation is close to the operational environment. There is no physical boiler at the moment. At Stepovnoy and Otcheretnyo, as well as in Syrsykyi, there aren't significant changes. But what you hear here is that there is all over Avdiivka Russian advances and capture. There's video footage from this morning, or photographic footage of this morning, of the Russians raising the Russian flag in the center of Avdiivka. So, to all intents and purposes, apart from the coke plant area, Avdiivka has fallen. The coke plant, there are reports from last night. So again, this is going back a few hours now. There are reports that at that stage, Russian troops had begun to enter areas of the coke plant. Avdiivka will, I would imagine, within the next 48 to 72 hours, fall completely under Russian control. What resistance may remain in the coke plant will be nominal and will be suppressed relatively quickly, you would think. There were reports that in 11 hours yesterday, over 60 Fab 500 and 1,000 bombs were dropped on Avdiivka. With the southern part of the township now being under Russian control, you can imagine that if required, that level of firepower would be concentrated on the coke plant area. If I just will go here for one moment. If we just have a look here, just to give you an idea of what that might mean. If we go into Avdiivka here, and we look at the coke plant area oops, is this area here. And the size of it from top to bottom, that's 2.6 kilometers. From side to side, it's 1.3 kilometers. That is not a large area. The Russians are entering it from the south. So if you are going to be concentrating Fab 500s on here, you can just imagine with that area that is concentrated powerful attacks, and that will suppress Ukrainian ability to do very much at all. Footage also last night of a Ukrainian wounded in Avdiivka having a phone call with his girlfriend in Ukraine and saying that they had been left behind. They thought they were going to be evacuated. It didn't happen. Some guys had tried to leave. Some of them had returned injured. Basically, they were just told, apparently he was on a call with someone else, and that someone was calling him, assuming he was the commander of the area, and going, hey, you're going to have to leave your wounded there, not realising the guy I was talking to was actually one of these wounded guys. It's a terrible situation. There are, however, some reports also that there are a large number of prisoners of war from Avdiivka. So hopefully some of these Ukrainian men have been captured by the Russians and now will not be facing immediate death, and that there will be some negotiations in the future about their return to Ukraine. The situation in general here is a dreadful one for President Zelensky, for General Syrsykyi. Now, there are some cynical speculation here that Syrsykyi, in taking over from General Zaluzhny, has committed himself to the support of President Zelensky. Zelensky wished to hold Avdiivka. Syrsykyi said he would do that for him. Part of what he did, reportedly, is to take some troops from the Zaporozhye region, the 3rd Brigade, which is reconstituted Azov Brigade, and other forces, other troops, taking them and other brigades that were loyal to the outgoing General Zaluzhny, and now pushing them into Avdiivka. The reasoning behind this is that those troops, because they were loyal to Zaluzhny, had previously been held back, protected and sheltered to some extent, and that now they were being used in Avdiivka so as to degrade them, so as to cause losses upon these Zaluzhny supporting brigades, so that they could not then go on to amass a coup against President Zelensky. I'll come back to that in just a moment, but just before I go there, it is interesting to see how the Western press and pro-Ukrainian accounts are talking about what has happened in Avdiivka. I mean, as you saw from those earlier pictures, that 8-hour change in the capture of the land taken. Avdiivka is a major failure and loss for Ukraine. The Study of War, the Institute for the Study of War, which is a US group, but very pro-Ukrainian, they announced yesterday Russian forces are conducting a tactical turning movement through Avdiivka. And this tactical turning movement is likely to create conditions that would force Ukrainian troops to withdraw from their positions in the settlement. So there's no mention of the loss of territory. It's that the Russians are just performing this unusual tactical turning maneuver or movement, which is likely to create conditions that would force Ukrainian troops to withdraw. While this was going on, there were reports from the field of areas just being overrun by the Russians. Other things on social media, this is an inconsequential township. It has no tactical, no strategic value. It took 10 years to capture this place. What are the Russians doing? They're so bad. Also, reports coming out that the Russians have lost trillions of troops in capturing Avdiivka. I mean, from the pro-Ukrainian channels, it really has been quite amazing, the numbers that they are suggesting the Russians have lost in capturing this area. What I find challenging, in arguing with some of these accounts online is that even when you raise points like, here is the footage of the Fab 500s hitting all over Avdiivka, 60 of them within a 10-hour period, TOS-1 flamethrower systems being used, constant air force being used in this area, that still the claim is, yeah, but the Russians are attacking, so they're losing 50 to 1 more or 20 to 1 more. It's quite mind-numbing in trying to understand the logic of how they get to these figures. And a lot of these pro-Ukrainian accounts just won't even engage in logical discussion of how they get to these figures. And once you press them on logic, they will usually just tell you you're talking out of your ass and to fuck off, which is pretty much exactly a comment I got from one of the big pro-Ukrainian channels on X the other day. Anyhow, if you're interested, you can go and have a look on X and Telegram, and you can see what is actually happening there on the ground. So Avdiivka is a big thing. A little bit of some other news, moving just off the front line for a moment. I will come back to the general, the Minister of Defence update, but a couple of other things. Germany has just signed a security guarantee with Ukraine. Again, this security guarantee, perhaps slightly different to the UK one, which, if you read it closely, appears more to be a security guarantee for the United Kingdom than it does for Ukraine. In it, point 7 in that UK security guarantee ties Ukraine into coming to the United Kingdom's aid if the United Kingdom falls under any threat from Russia. But this German one looks more to be just a hollow security guarantee, something which would be a PR victory for President Zelensky and for Chancellor Scholz. It, however, has an important caveat in it which says that Germany recalls that national budgetary allocations apply and require the express permission of the German Bundestag. So in any case where Ukraine put their hand up and said, hey, we need help, well, it will be based upon whatever our current budget levels are, and it needs to go and be voted on by the parliament. This isn't a, if you need help, it's coming guarantee. There are no commitments. There's nothing concrete in here about numbers. It just says that we will provide military aid, but it will be based upon what our budget is and if it gets approved. So that's happened. Funding for Ukraine is now being tied in the West, in Washington, in the United States, directly to Trump. It's all about Trump now. That, the reason that the funding isn't coming is because of Trump. And if you're unhappy that Ukraine is, Avdiivka has fallen, it's because of Trump. It's interesting just how already the media there is moving to blame everything on the bogeyman Donald Trump. He's not even, he's not in power. He has had just about every allegation thrown at him, it seems, through courts and things at the moment, and still he is the big bogeyman there for the Democrats. In terms of, again, with Ukraine, President Zelensky and Zaluzhny, this whole thing. Now, if you follow the channel, you'll know that a couple of weeks ago I started talking about, I thought the likelihood was very high for Zaluzhny to enact a military coup. He's the guy with the tanks. He's got good support within the military. If Zelensky had tried to get him out a couple of times and he'd rejected that, he had decided he would not resign. He would need to be fired. Anyhow, this is from Resident. Now, Resident is a Ukrainian channel, very good source of information, it seems. Zaluzhny in January had said that they should withdraw from Avdiivka and conserve their troops. Obviously, he could see the writing on the wall. Zelensky said no, and a survey has been taken. Now, this is an interesting survey. So this is coming from a Ukrainian channel, not from a Russian channel. It's saying, according to the survey, the majority of Ukrainians, 80% of Ukrainians, are categorically against General Zaluzhny's resignation. And the ex-commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine would receive almost twice as many votes as Zelensky in a hypothetical presidential election in Ukraine if it were to be held today. So the numbers are that if presidential elections were held today, this survey taken in Ukraine and being reported upon by a Ukrainian channel, says the results would be as follows. Zaluzhny would get nearly 40% of the vote. Zelensky would get just over 15% of the vote. Tymoshenko, just under 10% of the vote. And Poroshenko, 8% of the vote. So there has been some interesting dynamics between Zelensky and Zaluzhny. Lots of reports of fighting and disagreement between them. Yet a week ago, when Zaluzhny was given his Order of or Merit of Ukraine award by Zelensky, if you haven't seen that video, look that up. It's quite telling, I think. What I think you see in that video is either Zaluzhny is the best actor on the planet, and I don't think that's it, or Zaluzhny and Zelensky actually do have a very strong friendship. And the reason I say this is because in an award ceremony, a formal award ceremony, Kirill Budanov, head of the GRU, the Military Intelligence Directorate, he receives his award, and he's stiff, reserved, not smiling, receives his award, shakes hands, turns around and goes back to the line. Zaluzhny turns up with a huge smile on his face. As he's going to get the award, he grabs Zelensky in a big embrace, not just a hug, but like an embrace, takes his award, stands back, shakes hands, and then grabs Zelensky in another big embrace. Zelensky's trying to suppress this big smile on his face. These look like two close friends who've had a disagreement, have now got back together. So, interestingly, that tempered my position on the likelihood of a coup being raised by Zaluzhny. However, I don't think it's out of the question, and a coup could still occur, even perhaps not with Zaluzhny's direct leadership of it. It might be others within the military. But this does lead to these suggestions as to why the reconstituted Azov, the 3rd Brigade now, was immediately pulled out of Zaporozhye and in to try to help defend Avdiivka when the situation already looked as though that was just going to cause more losses for them. The resident also says that, I'll read their report here directly. It's translated, but it says, our source in the general staff, so here they're talking about a source they have within the Ukrainian military. Our source in the general staff said that General Syrsykyi cannot give the order to withdraw the military from Avdiivka without a decree from President Zelensky. President Zelensky, who went on a European tour, he's currently in Germany, and will be able to discuss the issue only in the evening. The President's office refuses to even discuss this issue so as not to spoil Zelensky's tour and demands that Syrsykyi hold the city. Now, it seems as though the Russians have had a different opinion to this and they have decided that they will take the city regardless. Okay, so that's Avdiivka. Yeah, over the next couple of days, as we will see, I imagine, the complete fall of Avdiivka. The only thing that may preclude that is the Russians may feel that they are in a position with the coke plant where it may be worthwhile for them to leave the gate open for a few days to allow more Ukrainian troops in. If Syrsykyi does wish to send in the 3rd Brigade and others to try to recapture the coke plant, and the Russians, who hold the high ground behind the coke plant, feel that this is worthwhile in terms of attrition, that may slow things down to some extent. But regardless, I think that Avdiivka will fall within the next 2 weeks because President Putin will obviously want to take this as a major military victory before the election happens. So it won't go on for too long, but it may run a little bit longer because we know there has been this tactic of allowing Ukrainians into areas. Bakhmut was a great example where they could be attrited. If you remember with Bakhmut, that was actually part of the conflict between Wagner and Yevgeny Prigozhin and Sergei Shoigu, was that the Wagner forces under Prigozhin were tasked with fighting in Bakhmut. But it seems that the strategy from the Ministry of Defense of Russia was they wished to use this as a cauldron and to draw in Ukrainian troops and attrit them, reduce them, demilitarize them was the term. The conflict was that Yevgeny Prigozhin, with his guys on the front line, was seeing opportunities to move forward and to take the township of Bakhmut, and ultimately got to the point where he wanted to claim that victory for Wagner. And it seems as though he did, to some extent, make that decision to move and complete and take Bakhmut, even while Sergei Shoigu, defense minister, was saying, this is not what we said and agreed. We wanted you to hold and just attrit these forces. So we've seen that as a strategy before from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Possible that this may happen around the coke plant. I think in some regards it makes sense to do that for another week or so and then close it down when the Russians are ready just before the election. There are, however, further reports coming out now that in the Zaporozhye region, there is a large amassing of Russian troops there. And so while Syrsykyi has pulled troops from Zaporozhye to try to hold Avdiivka and to perhaps to whittle away supporters for Zaluzhny, with amassing numbers of troops in Zaporozhye, we may now see a push back in the areas of Robotny and Verbova, and on the Vremka Ledge near Neskuchny and Ayurarajna, those areas there. We may see increased Russian numbers, and the gains that were made by the Ukrainians in the offensive are likely to rapidly be pushed back in those areas. There are, just quickly go back to the map here, so you can see what I'm talking about. If we just go down here, so here we have Staromayorska and this is the Vremka Ledge along here where the Ukrainians push down here through Neskuchny all the way down into this area here and past Urozhina here. This is likely to be pushed back, and over here Robotny and Verbova, this salient the Ukrainians created around here, is also likely to be pushed back. There are Russian advances right around here too. Stepove, around Kamyansk, this area here. And more interestingly, there have been increased attacks on Nikopol here, just over the reservoir. So the Dnieper River runs through here. Just remember, this is no longer water. This is all a dried out reservoir now with just a river running through it. So while this is about 5 kilometers across, previously, now it's maybe 100 meters of river to get across. And so the Russians have started activity around here on Nikopol again. This is, again, making me think that perhaps the Russians are planning to move across the Dnieper, make some roads across the Dnieper, perhaps come across here over the top just under Zaporozhye, come through Nikopol perhaps, maybe come through down here at the Novokhovka dam. The dam was destroyed, but the dam itself could possibly be repaired enough to allow traffic across it. And there has been this recent uptick too in this line along here, along Kherson, of sort of long-range Russian strikes in this area here, giving me the sense that the Russians are looking at finding pathways across the Dnieper so that they can then mount an attack to take Mykolaiv. I imagine circle around here. Sorry, let me make that a little bit bigger for you if I can. To circle around this area, cut these roads to Mykolaiv, and to ultimately then be able to get down and cut off Odessa. Now, if the Russians cut off Odessa, then the challenges that they've had in the Black Sea with sea drones attacking their navy, that would come to an end with the Russians taking all of the port access away from the Ukrainians there. On another report, I've seen some uptick apparently in activity of the US 82nd Airborne Group in Romania, where they have reportedly started, there's been an uptick in flights into the area, some suggestion that they are keeping a close eye on Odessa and that they may look to get involved in the future, speculation, if Russia does look to advance and take Odessa. So we're still some way away from there, but I think logically, I think we need to start thinking about what happens after Avdiivka now. And it may be that these attacks around Zaporozhye region may be allowing the Russians to start to figure out how they can get across the Dnieper and take Odessa ultimately. The story of Russian nuclear space weapons seems to have died off. On Wednesday, we were drawing to the point where Congress was about to go on 2 weeks of leave. Funding hadn't been approved for Ukraine, and it seemed that in the dying hours of that, this story came out that the Russians have got this big wonder weapon. We can't tell you what it is, but it's a national security threat. Oh, we've got to get funding. That seemed to be what happened. And the big story came out that Russia had some great new space weapon. No one seems to know what it is. It hasn't been clear what it is. Or maybe it's some capability that the Russians are going to use nukes in space. This is not a new concept. Nothing new here. Russia, so does China, and the US and India have the capability of firing missiles to destroy satellites. So that could be it. There is some talk that the Russians are investigating building a tiny nuclear-powered satellite that could then travel around with ample power to maneuver and be able to slide up alongside other satellites and interrogate them, use electronic warfare to shut them down, perhaps even physically destroy or incapacitate them, but I don't know that that's what's been developed thus far. Again, this isn't a brand new thing, and there's no indication that the Russians have developed this yet. It did seem to be a big story to try to draw attention and try to get funding approved in the last couple of hours before the break. It didn't happen. The funding hasn't been approved, and that story seems to have died off. In this realm of space, though, more reports that the Russians are using Starlink. I don't imagine there is any way for Elon to be able to shut down Russian-used Starlink. I imagine on the front line where they are, where there's distance between them and Ukrainian users of Starlink, and with front lines advancing and moving all the time, turning off Starlink to that area would turn off Starlink to everyone. People have asked the question of, well, how do the Russians get it? Can't they tell they're Russians buying it with credit cards? What I've heard suggested is that many of these Starlinks are purchased overseas through companies which have overseas registration. So it looks like someone in wherever it might be, not Russia, even the Middle East, is purchasing these units, and then they're just being sent to Russia and activated there. So if you look at who's activating them, it's, these are the guys who they bought them in the UAE. What are they doing in Russia? Not sure. Have they given them to the Ukrainians? Not sure. So that seems to be the problem, but there does seem to be reports from Russian Telegram channels that the Russians are using the Starlink, and that the Starlink is good, and that's why they are using it. It's apparently more reliable than some other satellite services they have, and to be fair to Elon, that makes sense. I mean, I would imagine there's a pretty good design and development team involved in the Starlink product. If you have kept an eye on the skies, you may have been fortunate enough to even seen some of their arrays going up. There are thousands of Starlink satellites up there now, so they have, I imagine, a very good redundant service capability, and therefore useful. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ministry of Defence numbers for the week. This is for the last week. But just before I do that, I want to talk about a recent report from the US source, The Hill. Laura Cooper, the Pentagon's Deputy Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine and Eurasia, said 315,000 Russian soldiers have died or been wounded in this conflict. Now, I'm going to say right now, I think that's probably right. I think that number, 315,000 Russian soldiers killed or wounded in this conflict, is probably about right. If you break that down as Squatsons on X has done, roughly break that down to 78,000 killed and 237,000 wounded. for your 315,000. That sounds about right. And the reason I say that sounds about right is because the only other quantitative analysis we have on Russian losses comes from the BBC and Mediazona, where they have throughout this conflict been tracking Russian obituaries in papers and social media, looking for things where people are saying, my husband or my son has been killed from the Russian side. And so they, maybe a month ago, I think they were estimating numbers of around 50,000 killed Russians in this conflict. And that did, I believe, include things like the militias from the Donbass and Wagner and groups like that, the PMCs. That was maybe a month ago, and that was around 50,000 killed is what they thought. And I've used that as the most reliable number I have. And, obviously the Russians are suffering losses in here. This is heavy fighting. There's plenty of video evidence of Russians losing large groups of men in certain areas. So I would suggest that this number of 315,000 killed and wounded for the Russians is probably about as accurate as we can get, and surprisingly frank reporting from the Pentagon. What this does mean, though, is that if you are going to accept this number of maybe 78,000 killed Russians, and given that the Mediazona 50K was from a month ago, there's been a lot of heavy fighting. There's been Avdiivka. These assaults obviously cost the Russians a lot. They're advancing all along the front line, so they are certainly losing men. You've got to then wonder what the Ukrainian numbers are. And this is where I run into the illogical, you're just talking out of your ass responses from the pro-Ukrainian channels. And I'm not being pro-Russian here, I'm being pro-logic here, pro-mathematics here. If you accept these numbers for the Russians, then given that the Russians have Fab 500, 1,150 bombs, which the Ukrainians don't, the Russians have the heavy flamethrower systems, the Solnit speak, the TOS ones, the Ukrainians don't. The Russians have an active air force who is actively operating day in and day out. The Ukrainians don't. The Russians are inflicting nightly drone and missile strikes on the rear areas, supply and logistics and repair and assembly factories of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians aren't doing this. Putting all of this together, it sounds to me like the Ukrainian losses must be far higher than these Russian numbers. And when we say far higher, my best guess is that we're talking between 5 and 10 times higher. Again, the response you'll often get back is, the Russians are advancing, and so you always lose more when you advance. There's a couple of problems with this. One of them is that that's not a rule, that you always lose more when you advance. There is an old military doctrine which says, look, if you want to take a position, you should probably have 3 times as many men as the defenders to guarantee that you will take that position. That gets turned into, you're going to lose 3 times as many men as you're attacking. And that then gets turned into, you're going to lose lots more men if you're attacking, which is not right. So when people say this, I pull them up on it and say, no, you're misinterpreting what you think you're understanding here. So that's a problem. It's not a guarantee that you're going to lose more men when you're attacking. Simply. And the assumption also, even in that you're going to need 3 more guys to guarantee that you'll take a position, is when you're assuming that both sides are equal. Now, the conditions are equal. Both sides have got air support. Both sides have got great artillery or whatever it might be. In the current situation, that is not the case. It's not equal. Even if the Russians are advancing, they're advancing with Air Force support, Fab 500 support, artillery overload support in front of them, softening and weakening those positions, TOS thermobarics hitting those locations before they advance. It's entirely likely that the Ukrainians are losing far more men in defence than the Russians are in advance. The second problem is that for half of this conflict, Ukraine has been on the advance. So, if by your own logic, if you want to argue that you lose more men when you're advancing, then the Ukrainians have been losing more men for half of this conflict, and they have all these challenges I've just suggested to you. So, this number that the Laura Cooper from the Pentagon has suggested for the Russians, I think it's probably about right. But then if that's 315,000 killed or wounded, go and times that by 5 or 10 for the Ukrainian numbers. And if you don't like it, then please explain your logic of why you don't think that that's the way that you would estimate the Ukrainian numbers. But anyhow, going on to the summary. This is the weekly summary from the Ministry of Defence, Russian Ministry of Defence over the last week. Just while I do this, I might just show you something which I thought you might find interesting. This is reportedly GoPro footage from Russian troops in storming of Nova Mikhailovka. I mean, it's, from my perspective, it's pretty full on. You can see why you have friendly fire, why people are shot by their own men. Obviously, these guys know what they're doing here, but still, blokes running in front of one another, popping up out of doorways. It would be very easy to suffer friendly fire. But again, just the sound alone just gives you an indication of what's going on, and this is happening everywhere. It's happening all across the front line. Anyhow, for the last week, the numbers have been about what we've seen over weeks in the last 6 or 8 weeks. The Ministry of Defence reports that the losses of Ukrainian men killed and wounded this week have been about 5,500. So if you multiply that out to a month, we're looking at about 24,000 lost this month. And that's lower than what the Ukrainian former Prosecutor General stated a couple of weeks ago. He's a member of the Rada Ukrainian Parliament. He stated that the losses are around 30,000. So it's interesting that the Russian Ministry of Defence have chosen a number that's lower than that. Well, not chosen, sorry, are reporting a number that totals to be lower than that over time. In the Kupiansk direction, 775 troops and 5 field artillery guns. Krasny Liman, 1,585 men killed or wounded, 3 artillery guns. Interesting, such low numbers in terms of artillery in these areas of Kupiansk and Krasny Liman. Pardon me. I do feel that we're seeing something. We're being told something with the artillery figures over the last few weeks. There have been quite a number of self-propelled units reportedly destroyed, which is a troubling sign, because if your self-propelled stuff is getting hit, they should be harder to hit than your fixed artillery pieces. And so if they're getting hit at high numbers, then you must be losing your fixed pieces at high numbers, you would infer. And just the low number in terms of a week's fighting in Kupiansk and Krasny Liman, a total of 8 across those 2 areas. And then we go to Donetsk. Donetsk, 1,800 troops reportedly killed and wounded, 25 field artillery guns reported lost. South Donetsk, 1,000 troops and 12 field artillery guns. Another interesting thing, just this in this week, is that I've noticed on at least 2 or 3 occasions now, the Russian Ministry of Defence aren't reporting on Zaporozhye. They've stopped providing their summary reports on what has happened in the Zaporozhye region. And I don't know why and what it means. I don't know if they are perhaps now just consolidating those numbers. And I think they may be now just consolidating them under South Donetsk. But previously they were reporting on the South Donetsk numbers and then Zaporozhye. I may have missed some update as to why this has happened. That's entirely possible. But it's something I've noticed. Interestingly, though, as I said, the numbers overall look to be about in line. So I'll keep an eye on that. I'll see if the reporting comes back or if I find some reason for why they've stopped reporting on Zaporozhye. In Kherson region here, 310 troops and 14 field artillery guns, a MiG-29 aircraft and 1 Mi-24 helicopter reportedly shot down in this week too. The Mi-24 helicopter, I saw some footage of that. I haven't seen footage of the MiG-29, but I imagine that this is what has happened there. Now I just want to jump over back to our map for a little bit and move on from Ukraine for a little bit and just talk here about Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, you may recall we talked a little bit about these, about what was happening here last year, around September of last year. Armenia, Azerbaijan have had a disputed region, the Nagorno-Karabakh area, which is highlighted on the map. You can see that red area. And now, last September, or thereabouts, an unusual, unexpected development occurred. Denis Pashinyan, who is the Prime Minister of Armenia, announced that he agreed that Nagorno-Karabakh was actually Azerbaijan territory and that it would be relinquished. And so it was. The Azerbaijan military then took over that region, and there was a mass exodus of Armenian people who had been living in Nagorno-Karabakh. And this seemed a weird thing to be doing, but it kind of, there's reasons for it. Now, for whatever reason, Armenia and Denis Pashinyan are separating themselves from Russia and are aligning themselves with the West. Pashinyan has been saying publicly that it's because Russia has not protected and supported Armenia against Azerbaijan. There have been wars between the two. That has been his public opinion there, or reasoning. Some things that have happened. Armenia last year failed to host the CSTO military exercises that they were meant to. The CSTO is the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and it's a grouping of military alliance between Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Russia. So while Armenia said at the time, we're not leaving the CSTO, they've just said, we don't think it's necessary that we have any military exercises and we're not going to host it. Now, at a similar time, they actually engaged with the United States in military exercises called Eagle Defender or something like that, Eagle something, very pro-American name. So Pashinyan has made the decision to align with the West now. Now, for the West, as you can see on the map, this is good for the West if they can get a foothold in Armenia, because in the area they are, Armenia touches Iran. So if they can put US troops into Armenia with the blessing of the Armenian Prime Minister, then they can move those troops and missiles and whatever they might be right up to the border with Iran. So this is, I think, why we are seeing activity here. And this is why it may become important. As we know, the conflict in Ukraine is one conflict, the conflict in Gaza and Israel is another one, and Iran is tied into that, and Turkey is closely related to both. So Armenia, with the US doing military exercises there, is going to get tied into this. Now, for Armenia, I'm sure that Denis Pashinyan, now I don't know, but I'm sure that he is receiving some sweet deal from the US to separate himself more from Russia. You can see the location here. Russia is not far away. America is thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away. Armenia, I feel, runs the risk of becoming Ukraine 2.0. It runs the risk of having US forces inserted in there, having training going on, which is obviously happening, NATO training, consultants, advisors, training up the Armenian armed forces, and if conflict begins, they will be the first ones to be chewed up. It's entirely possible that if it goes far enough, Azerbaijan will say, okay, we are going to start a conflict with you. Now, interesting, yesterday there are reports that 4 Armenian soldiers were killed on the border. So there's been some skirmish and some flare-up. So this might become a Russia-US proxy waged between Azerbaijan and Armenia, with Russia supporting Azerbaijan and Armenia being supported by the West, quite possibly Iran supporting Azerbaijan if that conflict were to occur. So this is something I think that we do want to keep an eye on, this area here. The French are also getting involved in here. The French have suggested that they will provide military aid to Armenia. So you can see the idea, the location. This is an important spot for the West and NATO and the US to be able to establish some sort of a foothold. They will then say, due to the ongoing conflict, Azerbaijan is wanting to ethnically cleanse Armenia. We need to help them, and so they'll pour in the resources that they can, and cause conflict in this region. But I think perhaps more importantly, it's just that if they get the okay, they can start to move missiles and things into near the border with Iran. Georgia has announced that, this was in November of last year, that France have begun moving military equipment in there. They were talking about armoured personnel carriers being shipped in, and likely other equipment is being moved in with that. The one last thing I'll finish up with today, just on the Middle East, as we've moved that way, I guess. Benjamin Netanyahu has stated, "At the cabinet meeting, I clarified my position regarding the recent talk of imposing a Palestinian state on Israel. My position is summed up in the following two sentences. 1. Israel outright rejects international dictates regarding a permanent settlement with the Palestinians. Such an arrangement will be reached only through direct negotiations between the parties without preconditions. 2. Israel will continue to oppose the unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state. Such recognition in the wake of the October 7 massacre would give a huge reward to unprecedented terrorism and prevent any future peace settlement." So we can see the Israeli position on the conflict there. So it doesn't look as though that is going to resolve itself quickly. And what that means is that we're likely to see a expansion of that conflict through the region. So I might come back over the weekend or in the next couple of days and put some more focus on what's happening in that area and how that might start to expand out and how it might start to connect up, as we see, with things like Armenia. All right, I hope you're having a good weekend. If you're enjoying the channel and you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe. If you know of people that would enjoy the channel, you think, please share it with them. I am on X, so if you're interested, you can catch up with me there, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.